Most people let a public failure bury them. They crumble under the weight of humiliation, internalize the narrative of defeat, and spend years rebuilding their shattered confidence. But for the elite, the Medici princes, the Churchills rising from political exile, the corporate titans who lost everything before conquering their industries, a setback is just high-quality fuel for a comeback. We are not here to comfort you. We are here to strip away the emotional fragility that keeps you weak and install a cold, Machiavellian lens that transforms your ruin into calculated pivot points. Stop mourning your losses. Start weaponizing them for ultimate dominance. Here's the truth they don't teach you in motivational seminars. Defeat is not the opposite of power. It's raw material. Every humiliation contains strategic intelligence. Every failure exposes the true architecture of the game you're playing. The question is whether you're sophisticated enough to extract that intelligence and ruthless enough to use it. Today, we're dissecting the exact mechanism elite operators use to convert catastrophic setbacks into asymmetric advantages. This isn't about resilience, it's about strategic repositioning, while your enemies celebrate prematurely. If you're ready to stop being a victim of your circumstances and start engineering your own rise to power, subscribe now. This channel doesn't coddle mediocrity. We architect dominance. Hit that notification bell, because what comes next will permanently rewire how you process failure. Let's begin. The anatomy of strategic defeat. March 15th, 44, BC. Julius Caesar lies dead on the Senate floor, all assassinated by men he considered allies. His adopted heir, Octavian, is 18 years old, untested, politically insignificant. Rome's power brokers, Brutus, Cassius, Mark Antony, dismiss him as a privileged child playing at politics. This dismissal was their fatal error. Octavian understood something profound about defeat. When the established order believes you're finished, you operate in a zone of zero strategic resistance. He didn't grieve publicly. He didn't rage against the conspirators. He studied the board. He identified which senators could be bought, which generals craved legitimacy, which populations needed a symbol. Within 13 years, he became Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, and ruled for 4 decades. The lesson? The moment everyone writes you off is the moment you gain operational invisibility. Let's be clinical about this. When Napoleon was exiled to Elba in 1814, Europe's monarchies threw parties celebrating his permanent removal from the continental chessboard. They reduced his security detail to a skeleton crew. They assumed a beaten man stays beaten. Napoleon returned within a year, reclaimed France without firing a shot, and forced the entire coalition to remobilize against him. His 100 Days campaign terrified Europe precisely because they'd made the amateur mistake of confusing a tactical retreat with strategic death. This is the first principle of Machiavellian Stoicism. Defeat is a perceptual state, not a material one. The moment you accept society's verdict on your failure is the moment you actually lose. But if you treat defeat as temporary repositioning, you maintain operational agency while your opponents grow complacent. The psychological mechanism. Here's where most people fail catastrophically. They allow the emotional trauma of defeat to contaminate their strategic assessment. They conflate the pain of humiliation with permanent damage to their position. This is a category error that costs decades. When you lose publicly, when your business collapses, when your political campaign implodes, when your relationship ends in humiliation, your nervous system floods with cortisol and adrenaline. Your amygdala hijacks executive function. You enter a state psychologists call learned helplessness, where you generalize one failure into a comprehensive assessment of your capabilities. This is exactly what your competitors want. They need you paralyzed by shame, because a defeated enemy who learns is far more dangerous than one who was never tested. The elite operator recognizes this neurological trap and refuses to enter it. They implement what I call the Stoic Quarantine Protocol, a systematic separation of emotional experience from strategic analysis. Marcus Aurelius, while fighting Germanic tribes on the freezing Danube frontier, wrote in his Meditations, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This wasn't inspirational fluff. It was operational doctrine. Every setback revealed enemy capabilities, terrain weaknesses, supply chain vulnerabilities. He converted military defeats into intelligence dossiers that shaped future victories. You must adopt the same discipline. When defeat arrives, you allocate exactly 72 hours for emotional processing. Grieve, rage, feel the full weight of humiliation. Then you shut it down completely and enter analysis mode. The intelligence extraction framework. Every defeat contains 3 categories of strategic intelligence that most people are too emotionally compromised to extract. First, capability gaps. Your failure revealed exactly where your skills, resources, or network proved inadequate. This is gold. Most people spend years operating on inflated self-assessments until reality delivers a correction. You just received free consulting on your actual versus perceived competence. The question is whether you're mature enough to accept the data. When Robert Moses, the notorious urban planner who reshaped New York City, lost his first major political battle in 1934, he didn't spiral into self-pity. He dissected exactly which power brokers he'd failed to court, which media relationships he'd neglected, which legal mechanisms he'd underestimated. He spent the next year systematically addressing each gap. By 1936, he'd accumulated more unelected power than anyone in New York's history, controlling billions in public works funding with minimal oversight. The capability gap isn't a judgment of your worth. It's a specification sheet for your next upgrade. Second, opposition tactics. Whoever defeated you just revealed their playbook. They showed you their decision-making speed, their resource allocation priorities, their psychological pressure points, their coalition structure. They essentially ran a live training simulation for you if you're sophisticated enough to study the footage. Think like a chess grandmaster reviewing a lost game. Garry Kasparov, after losing to IBM's Deep Blue in 1997, didn't claim the machine was unbeatable. He identified exactly which opening strategies the AI exploited, which endgame patterns it excelled at, which psychological tactics the IBM team used to rattle him. He converted that loss into a masterclass on human-AI competition that influenced decades of subsequent matches. Your opposition just spent resources and political capital defeating you. They exposed their methodology. Now you know exactly how they operate under pressure. Third, coalition instability. Defeat reveals who your true allies are. When you're winning, everyone claims association. When you're losing, the structure of your support network becomes crystalline. This is devastating information. After Richard Nixon's 1960 presidential loss to Kennedy, he watched his entire coalition evaporate. Donors stopped returning calls. Political operatives distanced themselves. Media that once courted him turned hostile. Most men would internalize this as personal rejection. Nixon cataloged it as strategic intelligence. He identified exactly which relationships were transactional versus ideological, which power brokers remained loyal during adversity, which geographic bases stayed solid. When he returned in 1968, he'd rebuilt his coalition using only the elements that proved durable under stress. He never again relied on fair-weather alliances. That's the advantage of being stress-tested by defeat. The critical transition point. There is a precise moment, a window measured in days, not weeks, where you must stop processing defeat emotionally and start weaponizing it strategically. Miss this window, and you calcify into bitterness, exploit it, and you convert trauma into tactical advantage. The signal is neurological. When you can describe your failure in third-person clinical terms without your heart rate spiking, you're ready to pivot. When you can say, the business collapsed because we mispriced customer acquisition costs and overestimated retention metrics, instead of, I'm a failure who ruined everything, you've achieved the necessary psychological distance. This is not about suppressing emotion. It's about compartmentalizing it so it doesn't contaminate your strategic assessment. Here's the brutal reality. Most people never make this transition. They spend years relitigating their defeat, explaining to anyone who will listen why it wasn't their fault, constructing elaborate narratives about external circumstances beyond their control. This is psychological self-immolation disguised as processing. The Machiavellian operator makes a different choice. They implement what I call the Strategic Narrative Reconstruction Protocol. Every defeat comes with a dominant narrative, the story your opposition tells about why you failed. This narrative, if allowed to calcify, becomes social reality. It constrains your future moves, limits your coalition-building capacity, and brands you with scarlet letters that repel resources. Your first strategic task is to construct a competing narrative that reframes your defeat as a deliberate, calculated withdrawal. When Steve Jobs was ousted from Apple in 1985, the dominant narrative was, visionary founder proves incapable of scaling company, professional management takes over. This story positioned him as a creative genius unsuited for operational leadership, a narrative that would have prevented any major company from hiring him as CEO. Jobs didn't accept this framing. He constructed a counter-narrative. I built the foundation that made Apple valuable, then stepped aside to incubate even more revolutionary technologies at Next and Pixar. This narrative reframed his departure as strategic portfolio diversification, not failure. When Apple's professional management nearly bankrupted the company by 1997 and came crawling back, Jobs' counter-narrative became the historical record. The man supposedly unfit to run a large company returned to build the most valuable corporation in human history. The counter-narrative isn't deception. It's strategic framing. You're highlighting different causal elements within the same event structure. Here's your protocol. Step 1. Identify the operational lesson. What did you learn from the defeat that competitors who haven't experienced similar failures don't know? This becomes the core of your counter-narrative. My previous venture failed because we optimized for growth over unit economics. That painful lesson now gives me an advantage every competitor who hasn't hit that wall lacks. Step 2. Reframe the timeline. Defeat is only failure if the story ends there. Extend the narrative arc forward. This wasn't the conclusion of my trajectory. It was the tuition payment for the next phase. Winston Churchill, wandering the political wilderness through the 1930s after the Gallipoli disaster and multiple electoral defeats, later framed those years as essential preparation for his wartime leadership. All my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and this trial. Step 3. Weaponize the optics. Low expectations are a strategic asset. When Michael Jordan was cut from his high school varsity basketball team, he didn't broadcast his humiliation. He used it as fuel while quietly dominating at the junior varsity level. When he made varsity the following year, he arrived with a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain and a work ethic his competitors couldn't match. Being underestimated bought him developmental space without pressure. You are doing the same thing. Your defeat lowered everyone's expectations. This gives you operational freedom to rebuild without surveillance. The silent repositioning. While your opposition celebrates their victory, you execute what military strategists call a strategic withdrawal to interior lines, a deliberate retreat to a more defensible position where you can consolidate resources and prepare your counteroffensive. Napoleon mastered this. During his 1812 Russian campaign, he was forced into a catastrophic retreat from Moscow. The Grande Armée, which had invaded with 600,000 men, limped back to Poland with barely 100,000 survivors. Europe's monarchies assumed he was finished. He returned to Paris, conscripted a new army, and within 6 months was back on the offensive, defeating coalition forces at Lutzen and Bautzen. How? During the retreat, he'd studied exactly which units maintained cohesion under stress, which supply systems proved resilient, which commanders panicked versus adapted. He used his catastrophic defeat as a brutal filter, identifying the elements worth preserving and ruthlessly cutting everything else. Your silent repositioning follows the same logic. Phase 1. Resource consolidation. Strip away every commitment, relationship, and project that isn't absolutely essential. Defeat grants you permission to burn bridges you were maintaining out of politeness or outdated obligations. You are rebuilding from zero. You need maximum flexibility. This means disappointing people. Accept it. Phase 2. Skill. Acquisition in darkness. While your competitors think you're finished, you're upgrading capabilities they don't know you're developing. This is your asymmetric window. When Amazon was dismissed as an online bookstore heading for .com oblivion in 2001, Jeff Bezos was quietly building AWS infrastructure that would eventually generate more profit than retail. When Netflix was mocked for nearly bankrupting itself with the streaming transition in 2011, Reed Hastings was investing in content production capabilities that competitors assumed were suicidal. They were repositioning in darkness. By the time competitors noticed, the gap was unbridgeable. Phase 3. Coalition restructuring. Remember that list of people who abandoned you during defeat? They don't get access to your next phase. You're building a new network from scratch. this time selecting only for demonstrated loyalty under pressure. This is cold-blooded but necessary. Fair-weather allies are worse than enemies. They give you false confidence that evaporates when tested. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, learned this during the Spartacus rebellion. After the Senate's initial forces failed, Crassus took command and immediately executed 1 in every 10 soldiers through decimation, a brutal culling that communicated that mediocre commitment was worse than enemy resistance. His reconstituted legions then crushed Spartacus's army. Crassus understood that a smaller force of committed operators beats a large coalition of half-engaged participants. You're doing the same thing. Rebuild small and lethal, not large and fragile. Leveraging enemy complacency, your opposition celebration is your strategic opening. Victory makes people stupid. It inflates egos, loosens operational discipline, and creates the delusion that the game is over. This is when you strike. When Howard Schultz returned to Starbucks as CEO in 2008, after the company had hemorrhaged 75% of its market value, competitors assumed he was desperately trying to prevent bankruptcy. They assumed wrong. While Schultz publicly focused on stabilization and refocusing on core values, he was quietly rebuilding supply chains, closing underperforming locations, and developing the mobile payment infrastructure that would eventually revolutionize the coffee industry. His competitors dismissed these moves as defensive retreat. By the time they realized Schultz had repositioned Starbucks for digital-first expansion, the gap was insurmountable. This is your playbook. While they're celebrating, you're rebuilding. While they're giving victory speeches, you're stress-testing new capabilities. While they're distracted by new targets, you're operating in their blind spot. The Machiavellian principle is simple. Appear weak when you are strong, strong when you are weak. During your repositioning phase, you want to project exhaustion, defeat, and irrelevance. You want competitors writing you off completely. This minimizes resistance while you rebuild. Frederick the Great of Prussia, after nearly losing the 7 Years' War multiple times, perfected this tactic. He would stage highly visible retreats that convinced enemy commanders they'd broken his army's will. Then, when coalition forces relaxed their formations and sent units home for winter, he'd strike with concentrated forces at weak points, winning battles his enemies thought were impossible because they'd mentally concluded he was defeated. You are Frederick. Your defeat is theater. Your real operations are invisible. Converting pain into precision. Every emotional scar from your defeat becomes a targeting system for your comeback. This isn't metaphorical. It's neurological. Trauma creates hypervigilance around the categories that caused you pain. Use that. If betrayal was the mechanism of your defeat, you now have a PhD-level education in detecting untrustworthiness. If financial mismanagement collapsed your venture, you now scrutinize cash flow with psychotic intensity. If political maneuvering outplayed you, you now read coalition dynamics like a native language. This is what Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragility, systems that gain from disorder. You're not just recovering from trauma. You're harvesting its educational value to become more formidable than someone who never experienced it. Consider Thomas Edison, the 1914 fire that destroyed his West Orange laboratory could have ended his career. He was 67 years old. Decades of research, prototype equipment, and chemical compounds vanished overnight. The financial loss exceeded $2 million, about $50 million today. His response: "Thank goodness all our mistakes were burned up. Now we can start fresh again." Within 3 weeks, he'd rebuilt enough infrastructure to resume operations. Within months, he was using the disaster to negotiate better insurance, update equipment with modern technology he'd been too busy to install, and reorganize his operation with the lessons from 20 years of accumulated inefficiencies. The fire was devastating. It was also a forced reset that cleared dead weight he'd been too sentimentally attached to eliminate voluntarily. Your defeat just did the same thing. It burned away the comfortable delusions, the unsustainable relationships, the business models held together with wishful thinking. Now, you rebuild from tested principles, not untested assumptions. The Systematic Upgrade Protocol. Here's your precise formula for converting defeat into dominance. Component 1. Capability gaps to training roadmap. Take every skilled deficit your failure exposed and build a 90-day intensive to address it. No excuses, no shortcuts. If public speaking was your weakness, you're joining Toastmasters and forcing yourself to present weekly. If financial modeling caused your collapse, you're taking university-level accounting courses and modeling businesses until you dream in balance sheets. Ray Dalio's Bridgewater Associates nearly imploded in 1982 when Dalio's macroeconomic predictions proved catastrophically wrong. He'd publicly predicted a depression. Instead, the market entered a historic bull run. He was so financially devastated, he had to borrow $4,000 from his father. Most hedge fund managers would have quit. Dalio treated his humiliation as a research question. What systematic process would prevent me from being this wrong again? He spent years building what became his principles, a radical transparency and systematic decision-making framework that transformed Bridgewater into the world's largest hedge fund. He didn't just recover. He used his failure as the foundation for an entirely new organizational architecture. Component 2. Opposition tactics to countermeasure development. Take every tactic that defeated you and build systematic defenses against it. This isn't paranoia. It's strategic immunization. If competitors used price dumping to kill your market share, you design business models that compete on value metrics other than price. If political operators used media manipulation, you build direct communication channels that bypass traditional gatekeepers. When Jeff Bezos faced relentless media criticism in the 2000s, he didn't try to appease journalists. He bought the Washington Post and built Amazon's own media infrastructure, from podcasts to streaming services. He made himself independent of the media institutions that could damage him. That's not playing defense. That's eliminating the enemy's most effective weapon by owning the battlefield. Component 3. Coalition instability to trust architecture. Build new relationships using the hard-won knowledge of what loyalty actually looks like. This means smaller networks, deeper commitments, and brutal honesty about transactional versus genuine alignment. When Julius Caesar rebuilt his political coalition after returning from Gaul, he didn't try to win over the Optimates, the aristocratic faction that would eventually kill him. He built an alternative power base among the populares, the military, and the emerging commercial class. He accepted that some opponents were structurally incompatible with his interests and stopped wasting energy on impossible conversions. You're doing the same. Some relationships can't be salvaged because they were never structurally sound. Stop mourning them. Start building with better materials. The timing of the counterstrike. There's an exact moment when you transition from rebuilding to offensive operations. Strike too early, and you're still weak. Strike too late, and you've ceded territory you'll never recover. The signal, when you can execute at your previous peak capacity plus the new capabilities you've built during repositioning, not when you feel confident, when you can demonstrate concrete capability upgrades that didn't exist before your defeat. Napoleon's return from Elba worked because he'd used his exile to study everything that went wrong in his final campaigns. He'd analyzed coalition warfare, logistics under hostile conditions, and the political dynamics that turned his marshals against him. When he returned, he wasn't the same commander who'd lost at Leipzig. He was an upgraded version with catastrophic failure on his resume and adaptive strategies most European commanders hadn't encountered. Your counterstrike follows the same logic. You're not returning to reclaim your old position. You're entering the arena as a fundamentally more dangerous operator who's been stress-tested by catastrophic failure and rebuilt with those lessons integrated. This terrifies competitors because they're fighting someone who's already survived the worst they can imagine. The psychological advantage of resurrection. There's a neurological phenomenon competitors experience when someone they wrote off returns stronger. Cognitive dissonance creates paralysis. Their entire mental model of you was based on your defeat. When you reappear as an upgraded threat, they can't integrate the new data fast enough. This is your asymmetric window. When Robert Downey Jr. returned to major films after years of substance abuse and career collapse, Hollywood executives literally didn't know how to process it. They'd mentally categorized him as damaged goods, an actor whose insurance costs made him unemployable. When Jon Favreau bet on him for Iron Man, the studio was hedging against catastrophic failure. Downey delivered the performance that launched the Marvel Cinematic Universe and became the highest-paid actor in film history. Competitors couldn't adapt fast enough because their models of him were 5 years out of date. You're weaponizing the same lag. While they're still operating on outdated assessments, you're executing with capabilities they don't know you possess, converting momentum into structure. The danger in comeback narratives is mistaking temporary momentum for sustainable dominance. Most resurrection stories end with a brief surge, followed by regression to mediocrity, because the operator fails to institutionalize their lessons. You're not making that mistake. Every capability you built during your rebuilding phase must be systematized so it compounds rather than atrophies. The discipline you maintained during adversity must become permanent operational doctrine, not something you abandon once you're comfortable again. This is where Machiavellian Stoicism becomes a lifestyle, not a crisis response. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Meditations not during peacetime luxury, but during a brutal Germanic campaign where he was cold, exhausted, and fighting enemies on multiple fronts." He built his philosophical framework under maximum stress specifically so it would be durable under any future conditions. You're doing the same. The habits you built during defeat, the analytical rigor, the emotional discipline, the ruthless prioritization, these aren't temporary measures. They're your new operating system. When Elon Musk faced simultaneous near bankruptcy at Tesla and SpaceX in 2008, he implemented work schedules and decision-making frameworks that most people couldn't maintain for a month. Sleep at the factory. Review every major decision personally. Cut all non-essential spending. Work 100-hour weeks. After both companies survived and eventually dominated their industries, Musk didn't relax those standards. He maintained the operational intensity because he recognized that the discipline required to survive crisis was the same discipline required to maintain dominance. That's your model. The version of you that emerged from defeat is the version that stays operational permanently. The empire built on scar tissue. Your competitive advantage isn't that you failed. It's that you extracted systematic intelligence from failure and rebuilt yourself as someone immune to the specific weaknesses that caused your collapse. This is how empires are built. The Mongol Empire rose to dominance not despite Genghis Khan's early defeats, but because of them. His capture and enslavement as a young man taught him exactly how tribal coalitions fracture under pressure. His early military losses against the Jin dynasty revealed weaknesses in traditional steppe warfare tactics. He spent years systematically addressing every vulnerability his failures exposed. By the time he began his conquest of Eurasia, he was commanding armies that moved faster, communicated better, and adapted more rapidly than any military force in history. His empire lasted not because he was naturally gifted, but because he'd been stress-tested by catastrophic failure and rebuilt himself as an operator immune to traditional military weaknesses. You're building the same empire, not in territory, but in capability. Every scar is a patch against a vulnerability that competitors who haven't been tested still carry. The final principle: permanent vigilance. Here's the brutal truth about converting defeat into dominance. It requires maintaining crisis-level operational intensity permanently. The moment you relax back into comfort, you begin the slow slide back toward mediocrity. This isn't sustainable for most people. It's why most comeback stories are temporary. Operators regress to their baseline once the immediate threat passes. But you're not most people. You've made a different choice. You've recognized that the alternative to permanent vigilance isn't comfortable success. It's eventual irrelevance. The world rewards operators who maintain predatory intensity regardless of circumstances. Markets don't care about your past victories. Competitors don't grant you credit for yesterday's dominance. So you adopt the mindset of perpetual wartime operation. Every day is an opportunity to compound advantages. Every interaction is a chance to gather intelligence. Every setback is a stress test, revealing which systems need upgrading. This is exhausting. It's also the only reliable path to sustained dominance. When you look at operators who maintain elite performance for decades, the Bezoses, the Dalios, the Churchills, you see the same pattern. They never left crisis mode. They maintained the urgency, discipline, and analytical rigor of someone fighting for survival, even after achieving overwhelming success. That's your new normal. Not because you're paranoid, but because you've learned the lesson defeat teaches. Comfort kills, vigilance compounds. We've covered the complete architecture of converting defeat into dominance. You now understand that failure is not the opposite of success. It's the raw material for it. You've learned how to extract intelligence from humiliation. Construct counter-narratives that reframe your retreat as strategic repositioning, and leverage enemy complacency to execute silent, rebuilding operations. You know the precise moment to stop mourning and start weaponizing. You understand how to systematize the lessons from catastrophic failure so they become permanent upgrades to your operational capacity. Most importantly, you've learned that the only difference between operators who rise from defeat and those who don't is psychological sophistication, the willingness to compartmentalize emotion from analysis, the discipline to rebuild systematically rather than react frantically, the patience to reposition in darkness while competitors celebrate prematurely. Your defeat was expensive. Make sure you extract every lesson it purchased, because the alternative, wasting the educational value of your catastrophic failure, is the only true loss. Now you have a choice. You can process this information passively and return to your existing patterns, or you can implement these protocols immediately and begin the systematic conversion of your setbacks into strategic advantages. The operators who dominate aren't the ones who never fail. They're the ones who fail faster, learn deeper, and rebuild more ruthlessly than their competition can adapt. If this framework resonated, if you recognize that your defeat was just expensive tuition for your next phase, then subscribe now. This channel doesn't traffic in comfortable lies or motivational platitudes. We architect dominance through strategic psychology, historical power dynamics, and Machiavellian precision. Hit that subscribe button. Enable notifications. Because while your competitors are celebrating their victory over you, we're designing your counterstrike. And when you return, not if, most when, they won't see it coming until it's too late. The game isn't over. It's just entering its most dangerous phase. Welcome to Strategic Stoicism. Let's build your empire on the ashes of your defeat.